Explanation. Welcome back to Global Current Lens, where headlines are decoded, strategies are exposed, and the truth about global events comes into focus. Explanation. A sudden decision has shaken the American political stage, the deployment of the National Guard into Chicago. Explanation. The images are striking: military vehicles on urban streets, soldiers standing where local police once held the line. Explanation. And a city already tense under the weight of political division. But this isn't just about Chicago, it's about power, precedent, and the invisible struggles shaping the future of American democracy. Quick context snapshot. In recent weeks, Chicago has faced a surge of violent crime, mounting social unrest, and sharp political clashes between local officials and Washington. Against this backdrop, former President Donald Trump, now at the center of the Republican campaign spotlight, announced what many view as a bold, others say alarming, move ordering the National Guard into Chicago. Explanation. Supporters argue this is a necessary act to restore law and order. Critics say it's a dangerous overreach of federal authority into local governance. At stake is not just Chicago's stability, but the larger question of how far executive power can extend inside America's borders. The immediate event, the deployment, came after weeks of escalating violence in Chicago's neighborhoods. Reports of increased shootings, robberies, and high-profile violent crimes had placed enormous pressure on both city officials and state leadership. Chicago's mayor publicly clashed with Trump over solutions, while local leaders demanded resources for jobs, policing reforms, and community investment. Trump took a different path, arguing that only a firm hand, backed by military discipline, could stop the bleeding. The National Guard units, typically mobilized for natural disasters or extreme emergencies, were suddenly ordered into an American city. Their mission was officially defined as supportive, assisting law enforcement, securing key infrastructure, but the sight of uniformed Guard soldiers in residential areas immediately fueled controversy. Was this truly about safety, or was it a political maneuver timed for maximum visibility? Initial reactions from the ground revealed a mixed reality. Some residents welcomed the Guard, relieved to see a visible deterrent against crime. Others felt fear and anger, viewing the deployment as an occupation. Civil liberties groups quickly raised alarms. Explanation. Warning that blurred lines between civilian policing and military enforcement could have long-lasting consequences. The tension wasn't just about crime. It was about optics, precedent, explanation, and the deeper question of what kind of nation America is becoming when political leaders normalize deploying military forces into domestic disputes. Explanation. Historical and political context. To understand the weight of this moment, we must step back. The National Guard has long served as the hinge between civilian order and military power. Legally, its role is distinct from the regular U.S. Army. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 restricts federal military involvement in domestic law enforcement, yet Guard units, often under state authority, occupy a gray zone. In American history, presidents have invoked federal troops or the National Guard at critical moments. Eisenhower sent them to enforce desegregation in Little Rock. Johnson deployed troops to control riots in Detroit in 1967. George H.W. Bush approved military support during the Los Angeles riots of 1992. Explanation. Each instance carried political risk, but the circumstances were extraordinary. What makes Chicago's case distinct is the political framing. Trump has consistently positioned himself as the candidate of law and order, echoing rhetoric used by Nixon in the late 1960s. Then, as now, crime and social unrest became central political themes. For Nixon, the strategy worked. He secured the presidency by appealing to voters' fears of chaos. Trump appears to be drawing from the same playbook. But history also warns of the costs. Militarizing domestic issues can deepen mistrust between citizens and government. When troops patrol streets, the boundary between democracy and authoritarian control feels thinner. Politically, the move puts Trump at the center of national debate. Is he defending citizens, exploiting their fears? Global reactions. The deployment didn't stay confined to U.S. headlines. Around the world, governments, analysts, and media outlets took notice. Allies in Europe, already uneasy about America's political polarization, expressed concern over what they saw as a troubling precedent. German commentators compared the images of soldiers in Chicago to moments in their own history when domestic crises justified extraordinary powers. In Asia, reactions were more strategic. China's state media highlighted deployment as evidence of U.S. instability. Explanation: a counter to Washington's frequent criticisms of China's handling of internal unrest. Russian outlets followed a similar line, framing the move as proof that America's democratic institutions are weaker than they appear. Meanwhile, global financial markets watched carefully. Explanation: while the deployment itself did not cause immediate economic shock, analysts began factoring in higher levels of domestic political risk in the United States. For international investors, images of a militarized Chicago raised questions: if unrest can escalate in one of America's largest cities. Explanation: what does that mean for stability nationwide? For U.S. allies, the concern wasn't just Chicago, it was about the credibility of American governance. If domestic politics now routinely involve military force, can the United States still claim moral authority in advocating for democracy abroad? Strategic stakes: decision to send the National Guard into Chicago has consequences beyond headlines. Economically, explanation: the city is one of America's most important financial and transportation hubs. Its stock exchanges, shipping routes, explanation, and corporate headquarters make it vital to both domestic and international commerce. Explanation: instability in Chicago doesn't just affect residents, it reverberates through supply chains and investor confidence. The presence of soldiers in city streets sends mixed signals to markets. On one hand, it suggests decisive action to protect economic assets. On the other, it signals fragility, suggesting that civil institutions alone are not enough to maintain stability. For businesses considering expansion or investment in Chicago, uncertainty grows. Strategically, Trump's move underscores his broader political narrative. By projecting strength in the face of disorder, he appeals to voters who believe traditional institutions have failed. Yet the stakes reach further. How this deployment is perceived could shape the 2024 election. If it restores calm, Trump strengthens his brand as a decisive leader. If it backfires, triggering protests, legal battles, explanation, or clashes between guard troops and civilians, it could erode trust not only in Trump, but in American institutions themselves. Internationally, his rivals are watching closely. If America normalizes using military force to manage domestic politics, its global credibility as a model of democratic governance is undermined. Allies might hesitate to follow U.S. leadership abroad. Adversaries will exploit the narrative to weaken Washington's influence. Possible futures: as the path forward holds several possibilities. Explanation: let us consider three scenarios. Scenario 1: de-escalation. In this outcome, the Guard's presence is temporary and effective, crime levels decrease, visible patrols deter violence, and residents feel safer. The Guard withdraws quietly after a short period, and the narrative becomes one of success, proof that decisive leadership can stabilize chaos. Politically, Trump claims victory, and the debate over legality fades in the shadow of restored order. Scenario 2: limited conflict. Here, the Guard faces sporadic resistance. Protests break out against what many perceive as militarization. Civil rights groups launch lawsuits. Tensions rise between local officials and the federal government. Explanation: while no widespread violence occurs, the deployment becomes a long-running controversy. Instead of solving the crime problem, it shifts focus to constitutional battles over executive authority. This scenario leaves the nation divided with no clear resolution. Scenario 3: escalation. In the worst-case scenario, the deployment triggers confrontation. Clashes erupt between residents and Guard troops. Captured on live television and amplified across social media, international observers condemn the scenes, while domestic unrest spreads to other cities. Calls for impeachment or legal challenges intensify, plunging Washington into deeper political crisis. In this trajectory, the very fabric of U.S. action democracy feels tested and America's global image suffers profound damage. Explanation: which scenario unfolds depends not only on Chicago's streets, but on the choices of leaders, the restraint of soldiers, and the voices of citizens who must navigate the blurred line between security and liberty. Tension peak and big question. We now arrive at the heart of the matter. Explanation: the deployment of the National Guard in Chicago is more than a reaction to crime, it is a mirror held up to the nation. What do Americans value most? Safety at any cost, or liberty at all costs? And can a democracy survive when the instruments of war become tools of domestic politics? Explanation: this moment feels larger than one city, larger than one leader. It forces a reckoning with questions that strike at the foundation of the American experiment. Question: where does authority end and freedom begin? As the world watches Chicago, one truth is clear: this story is not finished. Explanation: The guard's boots on the ground mark only the opening chapter of a struggle that will test America's identity, its politics, and its place in the world. Will history remember this as the moment when decisive leadership restored order, or the moment when a dangerous precedent was set? Thank you for joining us on Global Current Lens. Stay with us as we continue to track these developments, decode the strategies behind the headlines, and bring clarity to the events reshaping our world.